Hello friends, a very warm welcome to Ansarkari. I am Vikas Bhardwaj and again in this session we are going to take critically moving forward what was happening in the Cold War. You would have seen that we are taking up each event in a very sincere way and then we are trying to create an understanding. Whatever areas are remaining and we are not able to do so which are applied in nature, we will be doing it through understanding of newspaper, current affairs and so forth. Again, the idea is to make you have your own notes, have a clarity of thought, write back to me the critical questions which come to your mind after watching and also making your own notes in the theme, and then we are going to discuss it, and then I'm going to give you questions, or already you are having a lot of questions at the back of the lecture. If you feel like that they have been covered, then we will discuss them. If you feel like that they have not yet been covered, they will be covered in the future series. Let's move forward by understanding what is happening in this time period, that is Soviet Afghan War of December 1979 to February 1989. What is happening in this time period during the Cold War? So Soviet-Afghan War from December 1979 to February 1989 is a very, very important period in the Cold, not only for Asia but also for the rest of the world. Soviet-Afghan War took place in the Democratic Republic of Afghanistan in this time period. It is a beginning of protracted Afghan conflict. This is the key word which must come in your answer. It shows Soviet Union and the Afghan military fight against the rebelling Afghan mujahideen. So please understand, Soviet Union is on one side, Afghan military is also there supporting Soviet Union, and it is against the rebelling Afghan Mujahideen group of people who were actually looking forward to creating the state in Afghanistan on the basis of Islamic values. So there was not only one country, they will be backed by several countries and organizations. Majority of Mujahideen support came from Pakistan, United States, because it was part of Operation Cyclone. Pakistan was thinking that it will be its sphere of influence. US is thinking that Russia must not get, USSR must not get intervention in Afghanistan, and that's how cycle continued even till 2015, 2020, and so forth. Today, Taliban is there. Apart from these countries, United Kingdom, China, Iran, and Arab states of Persian Gulf, in addition to a large influx of foreign fighters known as Afghan Arabs, they were also part of it. American and British involvement on the side of Mujahideen escalated Cold War, and that is why one of the reasons why Osama bin Laden came into picture. He was a product of this war, and the short period of relaxed Soviet Union-United States relation was over. Combat was taking place in 1980s, mostly in Afghan countryside, as most of the country cities remained under Soviet control. So the conflict resulted in deaths of more than 3 million Afghans, millions who fled from the country as refugees, and today also it is continuing. Mostly externally displaced Afghans sought refuge in Pakistan and Iran. Between 6.5 to 11.5% of Afghanistan's household population, you can say, estimated to have been killed over the course of Soviet-Afghan war. The decade-long confrontation between Mujahideen and the Soviet and Afghan militaries inflicted great destruction throughout Afghanistan. It is a significant factor that contributed to the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Very important. It is for this reason the conflict is sometimes referred to as Soviet Union's Vietnam. In retrospective analysis, I hope you can understand it. This is how it is. Territory controlled by the Northern Alliance. Even India was also supporting Northern Alliance. We will be discussing about it further because India believed that those who are real upholders of Afghans' territory and destiny, they must be supported. So Northern Alliance, it is here, and then MSF international staff and members and MSF international members, they will be evacuated like the way we see when the forces were in US-led forces left Afghanistan. When we speak about the recent times. Afghan conflict is a term that refers to a series of events that kept Afghanistan in a near continuous state of armed conflict since 1970s. Early instability followed the collapse of Kingdom of Afghanistan in a largely non-violent 1973 coup d'état which deposed Afghanistan. That's how it is. So this is in 1992. Now this is in 1996. You can think of, and then this is in 2001. You see Taliban, control of Taliban is increasing in 1996 and 2001, and this is the end of 2001. So these developments are showcasing that how one power was not able to continue in Afghanistan. In fact, it will be the role of different powers and bodies. Detente, when we say international relations from 1970 to 1990s, then we have to use the word detente to means a permanent relaxation of tensions between East and the West. The first real signs of detente could be seen in 1970s with one or two blips along the way. Detente even led to the end of Cold War. What were these? The reasons were nuclear arsenals were built up. Both sides became increasingly fearful of catastrophic nuclear war in which there could not be any real winner. Both sides were sickened of by the horrors of Vietnam. In addition, country had their own individual motives for wanting detente. Both wanted to move on USSR and also in US. USSR finding the expense of keeping up with the Americans crippling. It was essential to reduce defense spending so that they could devote more resources to bringing living standards up to the Western levels. So both in USSR and in satellite states, all of which were suffering from economic difficulties, this was a great question. Similarly, in 1968, Russian troops were sent to Prague to deal with the disturbing development in Czechoslovakia when Alexander Dubček tried to introduce communism. We have discussed in our previous theme. He wanted to introduce communism with a human faith. There was unrest, and especially in Poland in 1970s, which threatened to destabilize the communist bloc. Same time, Russians were on bad terms with China, which did not want to be left out when relations between China and USA began to improve post 1971, and China became even permanent member of United Nations Security Council. The Americans were beginning to realize there must be a better way of coping with communism than the way in which they were having so little success in Vietnam. So clearly there were limits to what their military power could achieve. Some congressmen and senators were even beginning to talk about return to isolation. Why? Because the Chinese, even who were anxious about their isolation and they were nervous about American intervention in Vietnam after what had happened in Korea, they were not happy about the fact that what the US will do, and they were not happy about the fact that their relations with USSR were worsening. And it is the same time period in which USSR is going to have a great long-term strategic and fundamental friendship with India. So the nations of Western Europe were worried because they would be in the front line if nuclear war broke out. Willy Brandt, who became Chancellor of the West Germany in 1969, worked for better relations with the Eastern Europe under a policy known as Ostpolitik. So hotline telephone link, I have already discussed this point. Progress was made, and then in 1963, decision to conduct only underground nuclear tests. Subsequently, an accord was signed to prohibit use of nuclear weapons in outer space. Visit of the US President to Moscow in 1972. President Nixon became the first US President to visit Moscow. During the visit, Nixon and Brezhnev, the Secretary General of Soviet Communist Party, signed multiple agreements. These agreements focused on preventing accidental military clashes, arm control, cooperative research, expanding commerce, and including space exploration. So you can see today also there is a relationship which is thriving in certain regions, certain areas between US and USSR. Please do check out the list and I will check. The first major breakthrough came in 1972 when the two countries signed the Strategic Arm Limitation Treaty, also known as SALT I. It is also given in our NCRT textbook, which decided how many ABMs, ICBMs and SLBMs each side could have. There was no agreement about MIRVs. Full forms I am laying up to you. That's what we have discussed in our science lectures also. I'm just telling you one. There is airborne missiles or intercontinental ballistic missiles and so forth. The agreement did not reduce the amount of armament, but what it did was to slow down the arm race. Another key agreement during this time period was Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, which aimed to limit anti-ballistic missile system used in defending against missile-delivered nuclear weapons. Please do check out today. Just chat GPT or whatever you want to do and check out USA and USSR in the public domain. What is the comparison of these two nations as far as nuclear power and nuclear weapons is concerned? There is Helsinki Agreement of 1975 in which USA, Canada and the USSR and several European states accepted World War II European borders, acknowledging the division of Germany, communist borders of Eastern Europe. It introduced the Declaration of Human Rights Acts to the communist countries, including the freedom of speech and the right to immigrate. So this is a change. That's what we can say, part of detente. Abandonment of detentive policy in 1980 and the election of Ronald Reagan could be seen because Ronald Reagan, the president in 1984, particularly in 1975, when NATO reacted to the deployment of new Russian SS-20 missile by placing Pershing and cruise missiles in Europe. President Carter's effort to limit the arms race with SALT II agreement were hindered by events like Iranian Revolution and the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan. That is what we have discussed. Now you can think of the US Senate ultimately rejected SALT II treaty largely due to Russian invasion in Afghanistan and subsequently installation of pro-Soviet regime in Afghanistan. These events reignited old suspicions about Russian motives, and throughout 1970s KGB continued to suppress Soviet dissenters who criticized Soviet leadership. This is also happening today. Think about one great leader who was killed in the prison in USSR, Russia only in today's times, and then it was very much criticized by the Western world. So these kind of lingering issues are still there. The superpowers also indirectly clashed into the Third World during political crises in Middle East, Chile, Ethiopia, Angola, leading to designation of this period as Second Cold War. The next few years are sometimes referred to as Second Cold War because both sides spent first half of 1980s building up their nuclear arsenals. US President Reagan apparently gave go-ahead for the new weapon system that is called Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as Star Wars. This was intended to use weapons based in space to destroy ballistic missiles in flight. Very important, and you can think of where USA and USSR were thinking in 1990s. Detente gathered momentum again thanks to the determination of new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, very important leader and the leader in whose time you can say later on USSR is going to disintegrate. In November 1985, he had a meeting with Reagan in Geneva which went well and they issued joint statement that nuclear war cannot be won, must never be fought. There was sign that Detente was back on course. In April 1996, there was a disaster accident at the Chernobyl nuclear power station in Ukraine. Same Ukraine which is having war with Russia right now, and all nuclear power it had given up when USSR was disintegrated. This caused a great wave of anti-nuclear feeling in USSR. Gorbachev decided that measure to reduce nuclear dangers was absolutely vital. In October 1986, he invited Reagan at a summit in Reykjavik, proposed 15-year timetable for the step-by-step process for ridding the earth of nuclear weapons. American responded to some extent, though Reagan was not prepared to abandon his Star Wars project. At the next summit held in Washington in 1987 December, historic breakthrough was made. Reagan and Gorbachev formally signed Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. But do you really think it worked the way it should be, and what happened to today's times? All the land-based intermediate range, that is 300 to 3000 nuclear weapons, were to be scrapped over 3 years. It never happened. 436 American and 1575 Soviet warheads would include all Russian missiles in the East Germany and Czechoslovakia, and all American cruise and Pershing missiles based in Western Europe. There were strict verification provisions so that both sides could check that the weapons were actually being destroyed. Do you think it really happened? Why do you think Russia is so sure it says that I'm gonna use nuclear weapons if you're going to force me too much? That's why move on Ukraine. And even Iran was also so much confident when Russia was standing behind it. So you can think of Strategic Defense Initiative 1983. President Reagan proposed this SDI as an additional check on Soviet nuclear capability, space-based nuclear defense technology capable of striking down nuclear weapons before they could reach US. Today also US is having a space command. You can just chat GPT or Google about it more. Soviets feared SDI would increase the risk of US launching attack because it would not fear retaliation. The press decisively dubbed the plan as Star War. Many believed it was infeasible due to the enormous expense and the technical innovation it would require to become operational. Now here we are showing you how it is happening in today's times, what it is there. The land ground-based laser is there, battle manager is there, and then that's how it is going up. It is going up in the sky, and then through satellite you are going to make sure that when the missile is being launched, how it is intercepted and it is being put down. Let's think about China and USA for a moment. The relationship was marked by hostility from the victory of communists over the KMT in 1949, while China backed North Korea over South Korea in 1951 and then supporting Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam War. Very clear. However, in 1971, an unexpected shift in relationship when China invited an American table tennis team to visit, known as ping pong diplomacy. This led to USA calling off their veto of China's entry into the UN and marked the beginning of improved relations, and great loss for India. In fact, India was also given the permanent membership, but I don't know. We have to discuss it separately. India turned it down because it never wanted to be seen as part of certain bloc. In 1972, President Nixon visited China, met Mao Zedong, and making him the first US president to visit People's Republic of China. This led to realignment of China with the USA against Soviet Union, known as checkbook diplomacy. Relationship further improved in 1978 when President Carter withdrew recognition of nationalist China, that is Taiwan, formally recognized PRC, Republic of China, cementing diplomatic tie between the two countries. Through 1980s, the good relations and China valuing detente with the USA due to their conflict with Vietnam, and in 1985 an agreement on nuclear cooperation was signed. In June 1989, Chinese government used troops to disperse a student demonstration in Tiananmen Square, resulting in the tragic loss of life at widespread condemnation. This event causes strain in the relationship between China and USA. Today also, when they speak about what they are doing with Uyghurs, what is the human rights position and what they are doing with the Dalai Lama and what they have done in Tibet. So China and USA, and apart from the economic power that China had become, USA is no mood to let it allow to grow further. In 1999, United States and China reached an agreement on the WTO accessions to terms of China. China joined WTO in 2001. So late. So you can think of origin of ping pong diplomacy, and that's how it is. Let's see China and USSR. The relationship experienced a gradual deterioration starting in 1956. China did not approve of Khrushchev's policy, especially his belief in peaceful coexistence and possibility of achieving communism through non-violent means, because China was going to use violent means. They accused Russians of revisionism and distorting Marx and Lenin's teachings to serve their own interests. To pursue superiority over USSR, Mao initiated Great Leap Forward in 1958, which involved nuclear weapon development. In 1960, created further tensions between China and Soviet Union. The split between China and Soviet Union became apparent publicly in 1959 when USSR expressed support for the Tibetan people during their uprising against Chinese rule, and that's how Dalai Lama came to India. The Sino-Soviet split has ramifications beyond their borders, and in India, CPI and CPM also split in 1964. That is after China's invasion in India. Such was deterioration of relationship that the two communist powers nearly went to war in 1968 over a border dispute in Xinjiang. In that war, Soviet Union even threatened to use nuclear weapons against China. Apart from ideological differences, there was also a territorial dispute between the two nations. China demanded return of territories that China had annexed during the 19th century, like the way it speaks with India and also speaks with the rest of the South China Sea. The Zanbao incident, island incident known as Damansky Island incident, occurred in 1969 when Chinese and Soviet forces clashed on the border. While the conflict did not escalate, the use of nuclear weapons, such was the tension, means did not escalate to the use of nuclear weapons, such was the tension that Soviet Politburo was considering deploying nuclear weapons against Chinese threat. So during this tense time period, USSR, there was an opportunity of real politics of the USA. There was a secret visit of Henry Kissinger to China in 1971 and subsequent normalization relation with the USA under Nixon, and that's what we have discussed, that he visited Beijing in 1972. By the late 1970s, both Russia and China were competing for American support to gain leadership in global communist movement. To complicate matter further, Vietnam aligned itself with Russia, leading to further tensions. Relationship further hit the lowest point when China led to an attack on Vietnam in February 1979 in response to Vietnam's invasion of Cambodia in December 1978. That within 1 year, which overthrew the Khmer Rouge government support by China. Chinese attack was also fueled by territorial dispute. However, China withdrew their forces after 3 weeks. The split also made China closer to the US and Pakistan to support Afghan mujahideen against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. So we can understand that how China and Pakistan were also coming closer. The Sino-Soviet split fractured the international communist movement. It is also one of the reasons how USSR is going to be disintegrated and pave the way for improved relations between US and China under Nixon, as we have just discussed. So that's how the Cold War is not just the Cold War, it is actually very hot for Mother Earth. It is very hot for the planet. And India, and now you can think of that how different trajectory it has taken up. People's Republic of China, that's how Soviet Union, and that's how the Zhenbao incident it is there. Please do look at the locations in the map. In 1984, you can say the Chinese outlined their grievances against the USSR, including the presence of Russian troops in Afghanistan, Soviet support for Vietnamese troops in Kampuchea, and the Soviet military buildup along Chinese frontier of Mongolia and Manchuria. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev was determined to begin a new era in Sino-Russian relations. 5-year agreement on trade and economic cooperation was signed in July 1985. Regular contact took place between two governments. A formal reconciliation took place in May 1989. You can think of USSR about to disintegrate when Gorbachev visited Beijing. Vietnam also withdrew from Cambodia in 1989, and it also went on to have good relations with China. Now, the collapse of communism in Eastern Europe and the end of Cold War, now you can see it was not sudden, it was actually being reflected for a long time. International relations going to be transformed, and India was dependent upon Russia or USSR. That's why it had to realign itself, and it emerged out very stronger because we went on to take the path of liberalization and open economy after 1991. Between August 1988 to December 1991, remarkable events happened in Eastern Europe, and in this time period you can say the communism was swept away by the rising tide of popular opposition and mass demonstrations far more quickly than anyone could have imagined, or any CIA or any US support could have imagined. Process began in Poland in August 1988 when Solidarity Trade Union, it is also given in NCRT, union organized huge anti-government strikes. These eventually forced government to allow free elections in which the communists were heavily defeated. Revolutionary protests have rapidly spread to all other Russian satellite states. Hungary was the next to allow free elections in which communism again suffered the defeat. In East Germany, communist leader Erich Honecker wanted to disperse the demonstration by force, but he was overruled by his colleagues, and by the end of 1989, communist government had resigned. Soon Berlin was our breach, and most astonishing of all, by the summer of 1990, Germany was reunited. So maybe who is beneficiary? US is beneficiary, maybe UK is beneficiary for their own vested interests. Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania had thrown out their communist government by the end of 1989, and multi-layer party elections were held in Yugoslavia and in Albania in spring of 1991. By the end of 1991, USSR itself had to split into separate republics. Gorbachev resigned, and communist rule in Russia was over after 74 years. So the communist blocs, they are moving towards collapse because the states of Eastern Europe seemed on surface to be firmly under Russian control. Resentment against Moscow's hardline was simmering on, but then especially Poland and Czechoslovakia, They were the examples that it is going to continue for a long time. But then things started changing in Poland when Gomulka was forced to resign after a series of riots in 1970. His replacement, Gierek, also resigned in 1980 following industrial unrest, food shortages. These are the keywords which you're going to write in your answers. And strikes in port of Datsnuk and other cities. New government was forced to allow formation of an independent trade union movement known as Solidarity, as I've just discussed. Now, Russian troops, when they moved towards Polish frontier, but no invasion was taking place at that time because the troops were just sent there to as a mark of caution, and the troops were also sent into Afghanistan because USSR was believing that things will be moving to the correct direction on their own, but things were not going to be so. So Helsinki agreement, as we have just discussed, it was going to create problems for the communist bloc. These agreements were signed at conference in Helsinki by every nation in Europe except Albania and Andorra. Also by Canada, USA and Cyprus. They promised to work for increased cooperation in economic affairs and peacekeeping, protect human rights. That means modern Western capitalist method. Before very long, people in USSR and other communist states were accusing their governments of failing to allow basic human rights. Now you can say people always speak up. In Czechoslovakia, a human rights group calling itself Charter 77 was formed in 1977, and during 1980s it became more outspoken in the criticism of Husak government. In December 1986, a spokesperson for the group said, while Husak leaves, political stagnation will reign supreme. Once he has gone, the party will explode. That's how everyone knows that what actually must be done, but we all refuse to do so. By this time, all communist states were suffering from serious economic problems, much worse than those of other times. And not many people in the West realized it at the time that communism and communist bloc was fast approaching towards collapse and disintegration. Because when you are comparing with what is happening in Eastern Europe, what is happening in the Western Europe, what is happening in rest of the areas, everyone was believing that things will remain same, but from the inside it was a simmering discontent which was going to blast. So you can now think of Russia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, Europe, Slovakia, Germany, Poland, and so forth. Signatory of Helsinki Final Act, as I just shared with you, and then how European community is going to come up, and then how Eastern Europe is going to be part of European Union. You can also understand that. So let's see why and how did communism collapse in Eastern Europe. The short period between August 1988 and December 1991, the communism in Eastern Europe was swept away. Poland was the first to reject communism, closely followed by Hungary and then East Germany. And the rest will be doing until 1991. Even Russia had ceased to be a communist after 74 years. We can say so. Economic failure, because it did not produce the standard of living which should have been possible given the vast resources available, given what Karl Marx was saying. Economic systems were inefficient, over-centralized, subject to many restrictions, and all the states, for example, were expected to do most of the trading within communist bloc, so no freedom. And by the mid-1980s, there were problems everywhere. So do you really think what Donald Trump is speaking about, that I am going to impose same amount of the tariff that you are going to impose on us, it is also going to work in the longer run? That is the question. According to Bisha Glini, a BBC correspondent in Eastern Europe, increasing contact with the West in 1980 showed people how backward East was in comparison to the West. Living standards were falling further, and it must have their own leaders, and the communist system is the cause of all problems. Mikhail Gorbachev, who became the leader in March 1985, started the process which led to the collapse. That is what it is believed, but it actually went on to do in the right direction. He recognized the failing of the system and admitted it was an absurd situation, and the USSR, the world's biggest producer of steel, fuel and energy, please remember this, should be suffering shortages because of waste and inefficiency. Very sad. He hoped to save communism by revitalizing and modernizing it. He introduced new policies known as glasnost. And another word is perestroika. Very, very important for the prelims, for mains, and also for other optional subjects. So glasnost means openness, perestroika means economic and social reform. Criticism of the system was encouraged in the drive for improvement, provided nobody criticized the Communist Party. See, this is the catch. He also helped to engineer overthrow of old-fashioned hardline communist leaders in Czechoslovakia. He was probably involved in plotting the overthrow of East German, Romanian and Bulgarian leaders also. His hope was that more progressive leaders would increase the chances of saving communism in Russian satellites. Unfortunately for Gorbachev, when the process of reform began, it was impossible to control it. And the most dangerous time for any repressive regime is when it begins to try and reform itself by making concessions, because it was repressive, so no concessions are going to work for it. These were never enough to satisfy the critics, and in Russia, criticism inevitably turned against the Communist Party itself and demanded more and more. That is how public opinion even turned against Gorbachev, because many people felt he was not moving fast enough. The same happened in satellite states. Communist leadership found it difficult to adopt a new situation of having a leader in Moscow who was more progressive than they were. So you can think of, nobody imagined this is going to happen so fast. The critics became more daring. They realized that Gorbachev would not send Soviet troops into fire on them. With no help to be expected from Moscow when it came to the crisis, none of the communist governments were prepared to use the sufficient forces against demonstrators, except in Romania. So that is why rebellions were too widespread. It was requiring too huge commitment of tanks and troops to hold down the whole of Eastern Europe simultaneously. This was just not possible. And what was happening in Afghanistan because of USSR, everybody was knowing. So Gorbachev had no desire for an even greater involvement, because he had seen what we have got out of Afghanistan, nothing. And in the end, it was triumph of people's power. Demonstrations deliberately defied the threat of violence in such huge number that Trump would have to shoot a large proportion of big population, and the big cities were only to be in control when everybody was supposed to be killed. Poland leads the way because General uh, Jaruzelski, who became leader in 1981, was prepared to take tough line. When Solidarity, that is new trade union movement, demanded referendum to demonstrate the strength of its support, Jaruzelski declared martial law, that is the army taking control. He banned Solidarity movement and arrested thousands of activists. Still afraid of Russian military intervention, that is why everybody was feeling that things are going to not change. But then Jaruzelski felt it safe to lift martial law, and Solidarity members were gradually released. But the underlying problem was still there. All attempts to improve economy failed. 1988, he tried to economize by cutting government subsidies. Protest strikes broke out because the changes, things were changing, but the food prices were going up. Inflation was there. This time, Zelensky decided not to risk using force. He knew that there would be no backing from Moscow and realized that he needed opposition support to deal with the economic crisis. Talks opened in February 1989 between the communist government, Solidarity, and other opposition groups, including Roman Catholic Church, that has been loud in its criticism of the government led by Zelensky. So by April 1989, sensational changes in the constitution had been agreed. Solidarity was allowed to become a political party. There were to be two houses of parliament, lower house and the Senate. Lower house, 65% of seats had to be communist. Senate was to be freely elected, no guaranteed communist seats. Very, very amazing and a new free thing. The two houses voting together would elect a president who would then choose a prime minister. So you can think of it is going to pave the way for others. The peaceful revolution is spreading to Hungary. In Hungary, even Khader himself admitted in 1985 that living standard had fallen over previous 5 years, and he blamed poor management, poor organization, outdated machinery, equipment in the state sector of industry that they are responsible. New measures were decentralization. Company councils and elected work measures were there. But 1987, there was a conflict in the Communist Party that those who wanted more reform and those who wanted to return to the strict central control, because you can say vested interest would be there by the families, by the people, and there was complete lack of transparency. This reached a climax in May 1988 when, amid dramatic scenes at the party conference, Kader and 8 of his supporters were voted off Politburo, leaving the progressive in control. Free elections in March 1990, and in spite of change of the name to Hungarian Socialist Party, the communists suffered a crushing defeat. The election was won by Democratic Forum, whose leader Joseph Antal became prime minister. Similarly, in Germany, East Germany, Erich Honecker, who had been communist leader since 1971, he refused all reform and intended to stand firm along with Czechoslovakia, Romania, and rest to keep communism in place. But Honecker was soon overtaken by events. Gorbachev, desperate to get financial help for the USSR from West Germany, paid a visit to Chancellor Kohl in Bonn and promised to help bring an end to the divided Europe in return for German economic aid. In effect, he was secretly promising freedom to East Germany. That is happening in June 1989. During August to September 1989, thousands of East Germans began to escape to the west via Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary when Hungary opened its frontier with Austria. The Protestant church in East Germany became focus of an opposition party called New Forum, which campaigned to bring an end to the repressive and aesthetic communist regime. In October 1999, there was a wave of demonstration all over East Germany demanding freedom and end to communism. Now let's see. Czechoslovakia had one of the most successful economies of Eastern Europe. She had traded extensively with the West, and her industry and commerce remained beyond through 1970s. During 1980s, the economy ran into trouble, mainly because there had been very little added to modernize industry. Husak, who had been in power since 1968, resigned in 1987, and the successor Jakes did not have reputation as a reformer. So problem was going to be there. And that is why things changed suddenly in a matter of days when it became the Velvet Revolution in November 1989. There was a huge demonstration in Prague, which many people were injured brutally by the police. Charter 77, now led by the famous playwright Václav Havel, very important gentleman, a very renowned and distinguished figure. You must quote him in Essay and Ethics also. Organized further opposition after Alexander Dubak had spoken at public rally for the first time since 1968. A national strike was declared. This was enough to topple the communist regime. Jacques resigned and Havel was elected president in December 1989. The rest of the Eastern Europe was also reflecting to the end of communism in one or other ways. For example, Romania was a communist regime and Nicolae Ceausescu's leader since 1965, one of the most brutal and repressive anywhere in the world. His secret police, known as Securitate, was responsible for many deaths. When the revolution came, it was short and bloody. It began in the town of Western Romania known as Timisoara with demonstration in support of popular priest who was being harassed by Securitate. This was brutally put down and many people were killed. This caused outrage throughout the country and within 4 days Ceausescu and his wife appeared in the balcony of Communist Party headquarters in Bucharest to address mass rally. They believed that they were actually on the right side. They greeted them with boos and shouts of murders of Timisoara. Television coverage was abruptly halted. Ceausescu abandoned his speech. It seemed though the entire population of Bucharest was now streaming into street. At first the army fired at the crowds, many killed and wounded. But soon you can say the crowds came out again, but an army was refusing to continue the killing and Ceausescu had lost control. They were arrested, tried by a military tribunal and shot in December 1989. So Ceausescu was gone, but many elements of communism remained in Romania. The country never had democratic government. Opposition had been so ruthlessly crushed. There was no equivalent of Polish solidarity and check like the way we have seen in other countries. When a committee calling a sub-national Salvation Front was formed, it was full of former communists who, though admittedly they were communists who wanted to reform. And Ion Leescu, who had been member of Ceausescu government in 1984, was chosen as president. He won the president election in 1990. NSF won elections for the new parliament. They strongly denied the new government was really communist, but it was a different one. So that is how you can say how people's power is very important. Now the question arises, why now the whole Western Europe, when it has done so much damage along with the US to the rest of the world, and it want to stop migration to these countries, it want to stop people from even India, Asia, Africa and rest of the world to be coming over to Europe and see what they have done to themselves. This is very important to see the map. You must know, you must remember all the countries, and also you must remember all the previous satellite colonies, or you can say countries of even Soviet Union. So in Bulgaria, the communist leader Todor Zivakov, who had been in power in 1954, had been stubbornly refused all reforms, even pressurized by Gorbachev. Progressive communists decided to get rid of him, and Politburo voted to remove him. And in 1990 June, there were elections, and communists, now calling themselves Bulgarian Socialist Party, won a comfortable victory over the main opposition party, the Union Democratic Forces, probably because their propaganda machine told people that introduction of capitalism would become economic disaster. So you can think about these countries today also, that how they are moving forward. They are moving towards the west, but there are conservative elements and even right wing and left wing is also there. Albania had been communist since 1945 and the communist resistance movement seized power and set up republic. So with Yugoslavia, the Russians were not responsible for the introduction of communism. Since 1946 until his death in 1985, the leader had been Enver Hoxha, great admirer of Stalin and copied his system faithfully. And the new leader Ramiz Alia, Albania was still the poorest and most backward country in Europe. During winter of 1991, many young Albanians tried to escape from the poverty by crossing the Adriatic Sea to Italy, but most of them were sent back. By this time, student demonstrations breaking out, statues of Hoxha and Lenin were overturned. Eventually, communist leadership vowed to the inevitable and forced to have free elections. In 1992, first non-communist president Sali Berisha was elected. So this is what happened to Albania. Now let's see Yugoslavia, very important for the prelims and also for the mains. The most tragic events took place in Yugoslavia where the end of communism led to civil war and breakup of country. Yugoslavia was formed after the First World War and consisted of pre-First World War state of Serbia, plus territory gained by Serbia from Turkey in 1913. Very important, do follow the understanding. The territory taken from the defeated Habsburg Empire we have discussed initially. People from mixed nationality, now this is the problem. And the state was organized on federal lines. Six republics, Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, Slovenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina and Macedonia. Very, very important. I want you to remember this very clearly. Two provinces, that is Vojvodina and Kosovo, which were associated with Serbia. Okay. Now, under communism and the leadership of T2, the nationalist feeling of different people were kept strictly under control and the people were encouraged to think themselves primarily as Yugoslavs, not as Serbs or Croats. The different nationalities lived peacefully together and had apparently succeeded in putting behind them the memories of atrocities committed during the Second World War. So think of Habsburg Empire. Think of the Turkish control or Ottoman Empire before that. Think of six republics, that is Serbia, Croatia, Montenegro, Slovenia, Bosnia, Herzegovina and Macedonia, and two provinces of Vojvodina and Kosovo. One such atrocity was when Croat and Muslim supporters of the fascist regime were set up by the Italians to rule Croatia and Bosnia during the war, were responsible for murder of more than 7 lakh Serbs. So you can think of. So Croats are murdering another community, or there is a kind of ethnic cleansing. So things began to go wrong. Collective leadership seemed to work well at first, but the mid 1980s will be showing the rotten and the dark side of it. Economy was in trouble. Inflation was going at 90% in 1996. Employment was soaring very high, and there was a very, very high level of unemployment. Slobodan Milosevic, who became president of Serbia in 1988, bears much of the responsibility for the tragedy that followed. He deliberately stirred up Serbian nationalist feelings to increase his own popularity. Using the situation in Kosovo, he claimed that the Serbian minority in Kosovo, okay, Serbian minority in Kosovo was being terrorized by the Albanian majority, though there was no definite evidence of this. So by the 1990, free elections are also being laid down in other republics, and new non-communist governments had taken over. They resented Serbia's attitude, and none more so than Franjo Tuđman, a former communist and now the leader of right-wing Croatian Democratic Party and president of Croatia. He did all he could stir up the Croatian nationalism and wanted an independent state of Croatia. So you can see of what is happening. Everyone wants their own country, and each community was actually not ready to support the other community. So you can see with this map also what is happening with Slovenia is a different country today, Czech is different, Slovak is different, Croatia is different, and Serbia is also there, and Montenegro is also different. Slovenia also wanted to become independent, so the future looked bleak for the united Czechoslovakia. Only Milosevic opposed the breakup of the state, but he wanted to keep it on Serbian terms and refused to make any concession to other nationalities. He refused to accept a Croat president of Yugoslavia and use Yugoslav federal cash to help the Serb economy. So he was also worried about only Serbians. Situation was complicated because each republic had ethnic minorities. War was not inevitable. Statesmen like leaders prepared to make sensible concessions, peaceful resolutions, but they were not to be done. Yugoslavia broke up. The men like Milosevic and Tudjman in power. There was little chance of peaceful future. And that is what is going to happen. Very important you to understand that ethnic groups that constitute the largest percentage of population are shown as the background color that what you can see over here. Minorities constitute one-fourth or more of the population are shown with the diagonal cross hatching in their respective colors. You can stop on this slide and very much clearly you can see what is happening to Albanians, what is happening to Croats, where are Moldovians and so forth. The move to start war was there because the Serb and Croat war is there. Crisis point was June 1991 when Slovenia and Croatia declared themselves independent against the wishes of Serbia. Fighting seemed likely between troops of Yugoslav Federal Army, that is Serbian, stationed in these countries, and now the Croatian and Slovenian militia armies which had just been formed, they are also going to fight again. Civil war was avoided in Slovenia because there were very few Serbs living there. Serbian troops invaded the eastern parts of Croatia where many Serbs lived, and other towns and cities, including Dubrovnik on the Dalmatian coast, where they were, you can say, lot of fighting will be taking place. By the end of August 1991, they had captured about one-third of the country. Only then, having captured all territory he wanted, that is Serbian power, he wanted to agree to ceasefire. A UN force of 13,000 troops, that is UN Profor, was sent to the police of ceasefire in February 1992. By this time, international community had recognized the independence of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. But the war in Bosnia-Herzegovina will continue as the hostilities between Croatia and Serbia were dying down, even as more bloody struggle was going to break out in Bosnia, which contained a mixed population that is 44% Muslim, 33% Serb, and 17% Croat. Bosnia declared itself independent under the president of Muslim Alija Izetbegovic in March 1992. So, the European community recognized its independence, making the same mistake as it had done with Croatia. It failed to make sure that the new government guaranteed fair treatment of its minorities. The Bosnian Serbs rejected the new constitution and objected to a Muslim president. Fighting soon broke out between the Bosnian Serbs, who received help and encouragement from Serbia, obviously, and Bosnian Muslims. The Serbs hoped that a large strip of land in east of Bosnia, which bordered into Serbia, could break away from the Muslim-dominated Bosnia and become part of Serbia. At the same time, Croatia attacked and occupied areas in the north of Bosnia, where most of the Bosnians Croats lives. Such barbarism had not been seen in Europe since the Nazi treatment of Jews during the Second World War. Very, very important concept we are discussing. Must go through it twice or thrice. So you can think of the Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, was besieged and shelled by the Serbs, and throughout the country there was chaos. 2 million refugees had been driven out of their home by ethnic cleansing, no enough food, no medical supplies available. So you can think of Austria, and then you have Hungary, and then you have over there Romania, and then you have Bulgaria, then you have Albania, Greece, and so forth. So this is very, very important to see that how this Balkan zone is not even, not even at the center during the First World War. It is at the center during the Second World War also, and it is at the center during the 1990s also. So you can think of 1919, the Belgrade, the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats and Slovaks. It is renamed Slovenia and Yugoslavia in 1929. And then what is happening in 1946? You have Slovenia over here, and then you have Croatia. You can see the map, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. You have Montenegro, Kosovo, Macedonia, Serbia, Belgrade and Vojvodina. And then this is what is happening in 1992. So please understand with clarity that how this is developing. So during 1995, crucial changes took place which enabled a peace agreement to be signed in November. Serbs' behavior eventually proved too much for the international community. Serb forces again bombarded Sarajevo, killing number of people after they had promised to withdraw their heavy weapons. Serbs seized UN peacekeepers as hostages to deter NATO airstrikes. Serbs attacked and captured Srebrenica and Zepa, two of the UN safe areas, and at Srebrenica they committed perhaps ultimate act of barbarism by killing 8,000 Muslims in the terrible final burst of ethnic cleansing. So you can think of this is what happened. Croatia, it is here, and then Croatia. This is how Bosnia is. This is how corridors are there, and that's how the Bosnian peace settlement will be taken up at the end. So Bosnia was to remain one state with single elected parliament and president and a unified, you can say Sarajevo as its capital. The state would consist of two sections: Bosnian Muslims and Croat Federation, and the Bosnian Serb Republic. Gorazde, the surviving safe area, was to remain in the Muslim hands and linked to Sarajevo by a corridor through Serb territory. All indicted war criminals were banned from public life. All Bosnian refugees, over 2 million of them, had the right to return. There was to be freedom of movement throughout the new state. 60,000 NATO troops were there to police the settlement. This was understood that the UN would lift the economic sanctions on Serbia later on. There was a general relief at the peace. There were no real winners and the settlement was full of problems. Only time would tell whether it was possible to maintain new states or whether Bosnian Serb Republic would eventually try to break away and join the Serbia. The conflict in Kosovo, if we think about, then there was still the problem which is there because the Albanian majority bitterly resented Milosevic's hardline policies, as we have discussed, and the loss of much of their local provincial autonomy. So non-violent protests started in 1989 led by Ibrahim Rogova. Sensational events in Bosnia diverted attention away from Kosovo situation, which was largely ignored during the peace negotiations in the USA in 1995. Since the peaceful protest made no impression on Milosevic, more radical Albanian elements came to forefront with formation of Kosovo Liberation Army. By 1998, situation had reached the proportion of civil war. The Serb government security forces tried to suppress KLA like previously we have discussed. In the spring of 1999, Serb forces it unleashed a full-scale offensive committing atrocities against Albanians. They were widely reported abroad and the world's attention at last focused on Kosovo. When the peace negotiations broke down, the international community decided that something must be done to protect Albanians of Kosovo. So NATO forces carried out controversial bombing against the Serbia, hoping to force Milosevic to give way. However, this only made him more determined. He ordered a campaign of ethnic cleansing and drove hundreds and thousands of ethnic Albanians out of Kosovo into the neighboring states of Albania, Macedonia, and Montenegro. NATO airstrikes continued, and by June 1999, with his country's economy in ruins, Milosevic accepted a peace agreement worked out by Russia and Finland. He was forced to withdraw all Serb troops from Kosovo. Many of the Serb civilian population, afraid of Albanian reprisals, went with him. Most of the Albanian refugees were able to return to Kosovo. UN and NATO forces of more than 40,000 arrived to keep peace, while the UN MIC, that is the United Nations Mission on Kosovo, was to supervise the administration of the country until own government was capable of taking over. So at the end of 2003, there were still 20,000 peacekeeping troops there, and Kosovars were becoming impatient, complaining of poverty, unemployment, and corruption among the members of UN MIC. So you can think of the majority ethnic Serb areas of Kosovo. This is how it is. This is the region. That's how it is. And now with this map also you can understand very clearly Belgrade, Serbia, Kosovo, Bosnia Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Montenegro, very important for the mains and also for the prelims and even the concept. So the downfall of Milosevic, about whom we have been talking from last 10 minutes, is very important. By 1998, Milosevic had served 2 terms as the president of the Serbia and the constitution prevented him to standing for the third term. He managed to hold on power by getting Yugoslav federal parliament to appoint him president of Yugoslavia in 1997, though Yugoslavia by then consisted only of Serbia and Montenegro. In May 1999, he was indicted by the ICC, that is International Criminal Tribunal for former Yugoslavia at The Hague in Netherlands on the ground that as president of Yugoslavia, he was responsible for the crimes against international law committed by federal Yugoslav troops in Kosovo. Massive anti-Milosevic demonstrations took place in capital Belgrade when the crowd stormed the federal parliament and took control of TV stations. Milosevic conceded defeat and Kostunica became president. In 2001, Milosevic was arrested and handed over to International Tribunal Hague to face over war crime charges. Very important development. His trial opened in July 2001 and chose to conduct his own defense. No verdict has been reached when he died in March 2006. So a person, his thinking, his belief, his ideologies and the Western world's own selfish interest led to these kind of developments. And you say that India is not a peaceful country. In the elections at the end of 2003, the extreme nationalist Serbian radicals emerged as the largest single party, well ahead of Kostunica's party, which came second. The leader of radicals, that is Vojislav Seselj, who was said to be an admirer of Hitler and was in jail in The Hague awaiting trial on the war crime charges. The election result was a great disappointment to the USA and EU, which were both hoping that the extreme Serb nationalism had been eradicated, but it was not the case. In July 2008, Radovan Karadzic, the former Bosnian Serb leader, was arrested after 13 years in hiding and sent to The Hague, which was tried for war crimes. So you can think of this whole decade which we have discussed is very important because you can always get a question in the mains examination, you can get a question in the prelims, and also you must know what happened to Balkans in 1990s. Even this can be asked in your personality test and very important for history optional mains. Let's see the significance of regional grouping of ASEAN. We will discuss. This is a separate question. Role of evaluate the role of emerging powers in shaping the new world order post 1991. That is also very important from the GS perspective. We have discussed that, and we have to see that China's rise on India's strategic calculus, a separate question. This is which we have discussed in our discussions. Examine the changing dynamics of India-Russia relations. Examine India's response to global crises such as COVID-19. I have already put it here. How did the Cold War affect the process of decolonization in Africa? Describe the impact of China's economic reform post 98. Analyze the changes in international order after the collapse of USSR. I'm just giving you hints that these questions we have discussed separately, and we are going to take up one theme each because there are very important themes for that, so that you can understand what is happening. Decline of Soviet model we have discussed. Rise of market forces we have discussed. Evaluate the role of IMO and UN and WTO, that we will discuss separately. Expansion of globalization post 1990s also we will discuss, and the consequences of Russian Ukraine crisis which is happening today, that also we have to see, and the trace development of globalization and its socio-economic effects in 1990. These are just the hints and ideas which I am giving you, but the events that we have discussed, they form the basis for your understanding so that you can write classic and smart answers. So make sure to have your own themes, and we will discuss a couple of remaining ideas in our next lecture. Thank you very much, and do get success with confidence, clarity, hard work, persistence, like the way India is doing for the future.